I don't know what I was wearing. Terribly Chelsea, I thought I was. And really, I suppose I was as square as an ice cube with it.
Try that one over there. Right you are.
Oh, yes, I hate convention. You can't breathe. You have to break away.
When Julie Christie swung out of Billy Liar and down to London in Darling in 1965, cinema audiences were confronted by an entirely new creature. Here was a young woman who didn't just want to get married, who didn't just want to have children. Darling simply wanted to have everything. People were not yet talking about swinging London, and though we were all more relaxed about sex, well, some of us were, the pill was not widely available. But the city had become a magnet for a new generation of affluent young people and was attracting back the independent filmmakers who had spent the beginning of the 60s up north. John Schlesinger and Freddie Raphael built Darling around Julie Christie. It was the story of an ambitious and attractive young woman determined to lead her own life. It was on this river foreshore, here at Chiswick, that one of her romantic adventures began.
You couldn't let it slip the word.
Buried treasure.
Oh.
As we do, tells me down.
So I think that they were tossing the coin about whether they should or whether they shouldn't, and I think it's fairly clear what they should or shouldn't do. And bad behavior is something that people began to think they ought to indulge in the 60s, just as they had previously supposed that they ought to be good. They began to think that if one had nothing to reproach oneself for, one's life must have gone wrong somewhere.
Oh, how I'd love to live here.
I think you could say that the sort of film we did was a sort of spiritual mooning toward the Tory government, which at that time was composed of these venerable old persons. And then we got Perfumer, who, of course, did the unforgivable thing of screwing girls while being bald, which was something which the young in those days thought holy and proper, because we all had lots of hair then.
Harold Macmillan, surely a man worthy of our sympathy, bore the burden of the Perfumer affair, and some of the blame in Lord Denning's report. The Perfumer scandal was certainly Britain's political bombshell of '63, and even though notorious femme fatale may one day be forgotten, things will never be the same again.
We had a naive idea coming out of a different kind of cinema, which I was never involved in, which was the Tony Richardson and the Anderson stuff, that film was social comment. And that somehow or other, displaying bad behavior was a form, A, of sending up the government, and B, of suggesting that there was some other society in which bad behavior would not take place, i.e., God help us, a socialist one.
And the way young people do today, I mean, the way they dress.
But social comment is not normally a recipe for a successful film. What Raphael and Schlesinger offered as well was glamour, set in the new and fashionable world of the 60s media scene.
The film soared away, and everybody said, this is a new kind of film. And she was absolutely, maybe dated now, I don't know. But it was the absolute pin. It was the pin down of that boring, tiresome, throwaway lot, that disposable lot of the mid-60s. And she was absolutely epitome of it.
Diana Scott's story was intended to reproach the vanities of the new 60s acquisitive society.
The device which was part of the film, I mean, the very opening images are posting up Diana's story, rather heavy-handed, I think, over images of something to do with Biafra and hunger. And there was her rather trite story in a woman's magazine being advertised.
Well, I do want our readers to feel that this is really your story.
But despite the ironic tone, Diana's struggles to make something of herself had a dimension of truth to them.
I suppose it was all to do with trying to be economically independent, trying to be sexually independent, which was, and to put it on the screen, and not entirely to condemn it, but then to make it the focus of interest rather than peripheral to a man. I suppose those were all quite 60s things.
Although, in fact, she didn't represent a new economically or even morally different sort of woman, she somehow looked different from the rank girl, in particular, who had been in movies before.
I don't know whether it's...
Oh, thank you.
Could we have a look at that again?
Darling may have been the creation of the business and media men of the time, but she still had a mystery that fascinated and disconcerted them.
Have the public seen too much of her face?
How can you see too much of his face, Anthony?
I suppose it was something to do with wanting not to be curbed, wanting not to obey the sexual mores of the generation previous to you, wanting to feel that there was nothing you couldn't do, that includes sexual, and that was absolutely true of us in real life.
I wish you'd open up.
I can't do that.
Diana Scott is fascinated by powerful men and betrays her television producer for a Playboy advertising executive. And then quickly moves up the social ladder to marry an Italian prince.
It isn't every day that we have a new English princess.
It was seen from a male point of view. She was seen as mercenary and selfish, and it could have been, if you look at it from a woman's point of view, it could have been a kind of the only way out, or a kind of like brave actions that she took, but it wasn't. But she was condemned in the end, so in the end it wasn't quite as generous as we might have imagined it was.
At the end, Diana Scott finds herself walled up in an Italian palazzo, abandoned by her aristocratic husband. The wages of sin must be paid. The success of Darling was to be the start of a virtual cult of Julie Christie.
This way, please.
So masses of attention, all these interviews, all this concentration on yourself, who you're with, what you look like, what you think.
Julie Christie had become the cinematic face of the 60s, and as such, the embodiment of what was now being called swinging London.
I suppose let's go back to the Beatles, I mean, really, isn't it? You know, we were lucky enough that they were quite cool and hip, and there weren't an awful lot of cool, hip people around, not the majority, and that they became idols, and like any idol, they were copied. So that's why London perhaps is now cool and hip.
And John said, what kind of movie are we going to make? I said, we're going to make a comedy. And he said, okay, you can be the producer. And when they asked about a director, I said, I'd like to use Richard Lester, who did the Goon shows on television. And they all said, get him.
John Lennon once described A Hard Day's Night as a film about a car and a train and a room and a room and a car and a cheese sandwich. And I think that's how he remembered most of 1964, life on the run. We filmed one of the first scenes here at Marylebone Station. The Beatles were being chased by hundreds of teenage girls, some of whom we'd hired, and most of whom we hadn't.
Because until I'd seen them, I had no idea, personally, of the effect that they had. I sort of was fascinated with the banter between them. It was all like they were brothers. They had a private language which they seemed to be able to communicate with themselves in, and which I tried to use.
Most people think that perhaps the director and the cameraman and the Beatles went out on a Sunday afternoon and improvised this movie. I have that script, and all those ad-libs were written. And that's the script that got him an Oscar nomination.
As we were making the film to resemble a documentary, I felt we had to be in a real train, although we gave ourselves huge technical problems. The sound equipment of the 1960s was still very cumbersome, and all the Beatles lines had to be redone in the dubbing theatre later on. The Beatles were, of course, new to acting, and hadn't had time to react against the artificiality of it all. They were still enjoying the experience, thanks greatly to the way Alan Owen tailored their parts and lines so skillfully to their own personalities.
Hard Day's Night appealed to me greatly. I thought they were great, and I thought it was clever how they did it. They actually took them again and used them as they were. Ringo was Ringo, and John was John, and they were allowed to be cynical John or happy-go-lucky Paul and serious George and crazy Ringo. And it was filmed almost documentary fashion. And, I mean, although documentaries aren't new, putting a band like this and using it as light entertainment was new. So I mean, I thought it was a terrific film. I loved it. I mean, it was black and white, wasn't it? It's the only thing I didn't like about it. and said it was black and white. I much preferred Help because it was in colour. I mean, I don't mind watching black and white movies, but I like things in colour. Life's in colour, it's not in black and white.
Cliff's own star vehicles, like the 1961 offering The Young Ones, sought to woo a family audience over to rock and roll, still considered a dubious form of entertainment, with lashings of wholesome musical comedy pizzazz.
We know before we go to bed. We've got a night of fun ahead, so see you at the dance.
So the public could get in and we eased them into it, and then suddenly we'd get, got a funny feeling that I fall.
Oh, I got a funny feeling that I've fallen in love with you.
And it was acceptable. And what became acceptable, although not 100%, but acceptable business-wise to mums and dads, it opened up my career so much. It was like an overnight change. One minute I was a rock and roll phenomenon. Next night I was an all-round entertainer.
To know Cliff is to know you wouldn't buy him as anything but what he was. I mean, he later went into missionary work. So that soul was still there. This was a clean-cut old British boy.
Off we go on a holiday, and it's you we have to plan. Fellas.
I still believe that of all the films I've made, probably the one that will remain with me forever is Summer Holiday. For all sorts of reasons. For a start, I'd lost all the weight I wanted to lose. I thought I looked dreadful in The Young Ones, and I began to look the way I wanted to look physically. But also, this film, I think, really worked.
See you, fellas. Thanks. Cheers.
For me, we captured something here that probably was the pinnacle of all of that. And it was downhill from this, as far as I was concerned. After Summer Holiday, it was downhill as far as my movies were concerned.
We're all going on a summer holiday. No more working for a week or two. Fun and laughter on a summer holiday. No more worries for me or you. For a week or two. We're going where the sun shines.
I wasn't dealing with the way it really was. Although we shot it again against type, instead of doing, we're all going on a summer's holiday, and all that lovely lighting and really gritty.
Again, you see, they had all the movies that we've made. So, you know, sometimes it's almost too easy and too glib for me to say this, and I hope I'm not overstating it and blowing my own trumpet too much. But you see, because we did our films our way, what could the Beatles possibly do other than do it our way or say, we don't want to do it that way? And you are forced into a situation where you find another way of doing it. And that's what progress is about.
Let's get something very clear about the Beatles deal. We made the deal for one reason. There was a potentially successful musical group who were interested in making movies because their manager had contacted us, and our music guy in London said, I think these guys are talented. We were expanding our music and recording company, so we were going to get publishing rights and soundtrack album rights. The cost of the movie was clearly going to be very limited. That's all it was. It was a value judgment made on, gee, we don't have anything like this. If they hit, we'll have something very worthwhile. I had never even seen them perform.
Mind you, by 1964, United Artists were on a pretty hot streak. They had been one of the first American film companies to set up over here, and had made a fortune in Britain with the first two James Bond pictures and the Oscar-winning Tom Jones. They were also the only company I knew who would say about a proposed project, we'll let you know by Friday, and then if they gave you the go-ahead, not see you again until the premiere. A Hard Day's Night cost £190,000, and it was the only film I've ever worked on that was in profit before it opened, thanks to the pre-sales of the soundtrack album, cleverly owned by United Artists. The Pleasure Girls, which came out in the summer of '65, made a brave stab at showing what life was like for sparky young women coming to the capital in the mid-'60s.
I'm in the middle of washing my hair. Hang on, I'll chuck your tea down. Actually, it's a bit of a mess. Oh, it's super. From what you said in your letter, I expect it's some desperate slum with cockroaches, a leaking roof and the lot. Oh, hell, we pay enough for it. 15 quid a week.
The flat, the flatmates, independence, boyfriends. These weren't quite a cliché in 1965 when the Pleasure Girls came out, but the King's Road was fast becoming one, stacked with boutiques imitating Mary Quant's trend-setting bazaar.
Well, Jersey cows
We ventured into these dangerous waters with the Knack at about the same time, but my young flatmates had a bit more fantasy about them and weren't quite so posh.
They used to go on all fours and they hung down once, vertically. But now they stand upright and it puts on this terrible strain. All right, but it's true.
Those leave his footprints in the butter.
I don't.
I've heard it before.
Don't show up.
Look, you're in. Never go. It will.
She's in there. I know she's in there. Now then, I recognize your voice. You've got my daughter in there. Recognize her voice, too. Rave. You haven't raved? Has it become one long rave?
Oh, I won't say any more. Just get your clothes on. I won't say any more.
Everything was done in here, all the interiors. And this, we were in and out of this window all the time. And this is where David Watkin had the completely white room, which was unbelievably difficult as an actor to work in because it was blinding.
The vampires, I should be so childish.
Cameraman David Watkin devised a high-key photographic style for the film, which was very distinctive and was a bit similar to things we'd been trying out in advertising shoots at the time.
Well, anyway, he takes the box in his left hand and the whip, imagine the whip, in his right. And he advances on the line. And he rides.
The people we put into this house in Hammersmith, the cool womanizer, the anxious teacher, the voluble artist, and the young ingenue from the provinces, were meant to be a microcosm of London in its early swinging days. Something had definitely changed from the time when I was first trying to find accommodation in London. Whether it was the relaxation in our attitude to sex, or the relaxation in the laws of rented accommodation, for a young man, possibilities were definitely improving. What I remember as a dreary bed sit could be transformed with a lick of paint into the pad.
Homegrown loans for self-improvement.
He's carrying out improvements all the time.
2 houses in every garage by 1970. You can't say fairer than that.
Of course, it helps us rats, you know.
Jerry built, pardon my French.
We had a Greek chorus of elderly people who commented on the younger generation. And we used all of the tricks of filmmaking that I could think of at the time.
There is mastery in a job well done if you have a way with tools.
A good workman never blames his.
I do. I blame the screwdriver.
I think Richard gave me something I never had since. A breakdown of every scene, exactly how long it took. The little bits in between that he wanted to fill with something, some kind of comment. And I worked them all out, and I said them to myself so that they fitted exactly to the second. And I wrote all kinds of strange non-sequiturs that we later put on in the cutting room.
They rule the streets.
I'd rule them. Conscription.
She'll regret she didn't wear a safety device. I feel for her chest. That's my feeling.
They've ruined the sea for me.
I'm bound.
Legs up, all up the road.
I'm bound by my age.
Skirts up, showing everything.
I've been raped. Raped.
I had to go up to people and say, well, not the funniest thing, I've been raped. But this we're talking about 26, 27 years ago. And people, you know, very British, they'd sort of look at me and think, I'm not going to get involved in this.
Rape!
Nowadays, everyone would say, let's get you to the police station, let's help you. But then it was that I'd go and say, I've been raped, and they'd go, we won't get involved with her, she's obviously mad.
We were sort of oddities, which is perhaps why we fitted into the 60s cinema.
Yeah.
In where we weren't the norm of the mould. There were also a rash of the long-legged, mini-skirted, very trendy girls.
Yeah.
You know, this sort of Susie Kendall and I mean even Julie Christie. She was.
Oh, yeah,
she was
very different.
Different, yes. She was very, very different. But there was quite a rash of the really put together. We were like put together, but it had all gone wrong. Yes, Jigsaw is perfect. Yeah.
Georgie Girl, who couldn't get what she wanted sexually, was to become one of the most commercially successful British movies of the decade.
I was certainly never dreamed that there would be a part which I would be suitable for that could be the leading role of a movie. I didn't fit into that feeling of confidence that pervaded the 60s. It seemed to me that the people who looked like they knew what they were doing, they looked like they'd stepped right out of Mary Quant's window, for one thing. Or so wonderfully eccentric that they somehow had their own style. I had no style. And I kept trying to. I would put on all the 60s clothes. I would put on Mary Quant's makeup. I had a very round face, and I put great brown things here, and I would get the silver highlighter and put it here, and I would draw on Twiggy's eyelashes. But it just didn't look quite the same on me.
A happy ending is, of course, one of the essential requirements for a successful picture. Although Georgie Girl's twist had her marrying her repellent old guardian, played with considerable charm by James Mason. This was all a ploy for her to be able to take over the baby abandoned by cold-hearted bitch, the Charlotte Rampling character, Meredith. Georgie Girl came out when American fascination for the English new morality was at its height. And of course it did also have the benefit of a theme song, trading in some decidedly non-PC stereotypes.
When you're a mother at heart, that's all you wanted right from the start. Well, didn't you? Hey, there's Georgie Girl, now that you're no longer on the shelf.
My sister was the original casting for Georgie, and even by her own admission, I think an odd original casting, since Vanessa was graceful, elegant, absolutely not out of place. Vanessa fitted into the 60s like a hand into a glove.
Vanessa Redgrave had in fact decided to join Carol Rice, the director of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, now embarking on his nearest approximation to a swinging London film. He'd seen a likely television play by David Mercer and was impressed by Vanessa Redgrave's recent big successes in the theatre.
When we made the film and wanted to cast her, the money people said, you can't have her. She's not a movie star. Nobody knows her. And we said, well, we've got to have her. And there was a confrontation which sort of went up to the wire, and finally they let us have her.
Because Carol was extraordinary with all the actors, because he was both very, very patient and very tender with us, and very encouraging with us. Wonderfully encouraging. He'd always say, excellent, now we'll do it again. Well, you know, if you're going to have to do it again, it can't have been all that excellent.
Vanessa Redgrave played the well-to-do Kensington ex-wife of Morgan, a troubled, impossible misfit from a traditional working-class socialist background. His political and psychological confusion is sublimated into an obsession with Guy the gorilla.
It is a film about the inside of this man's head. What he feels and thinks and associates with is the actual subject of the film.
I did go and see psychiatrist today.
I hope he told you to return my car.
No, he took me very seriously.
Everybody takes you seriously until they get to know you.
His disillusionment with the gods that failed, which was very much my own history. The humour, the doubt, and the surreal expression of the character, which was implied in the original television.
What was dominant was David Mercer's wit and actually, in the most serious sense, involvement with Lang's theories.
Morgan, an outcast in the urban wilderness, embodied Lang's theories of how society breaks the nonconformist.
Gorilla. If Morgan kept it up, the ultimate thing that would happen to him was that it would be that he would have a lobotomy, which is an operation which cuts part of the brain off from another part of the brain in order to make someone behave normal. So what we can take that to mean is that the normal person has been subject to a successful social lobotomy.
At that time, which I was really unaware of, was a whole new psychiatry coming in, and there was R.D. Lang and David something. All those kind of things were really not part of me. And also my political background, which I mean the political, you know, the hammer and sickle and all the songs and the stuff. You know, I had to sort of ask David.
I don't see Morgan as being a madman at all. Anyway, I don't really understand anymore what people mean by madman. It seems to me, for example, that for politicians and generals to be prepared to do the things that they are doing is what I would call genuine madness.
Sometimes I didn't quite know which side of Morgan I came out on, whether I found him really irritating. And I mean, I didn't behave in my life very much like him, maybe a little bit.
I want the police! Yes, I want the police!
The battle between Leonie and Morgan was finally resolved, as you remember, by the fact that Leonie has Morgan's son. And that is the end of the film. It's Morgan's son.
Is that my baby?
Alfabetizar venceremos. Dicen los americanos que Fideles comunistas.
Vanessa Redgrave was more familiarly to be seen as a passionate supporter of the great causes of the 60s. Here, solidarity with Cuba.
Patria o muerte venceremos.
Some people are on the pitch. They think it's all over. It is now. It's four.
In July 1966, England was briefly, and quite literally, top of the world.
Madness to the Queen. It's only 12 inches high, solid gold, and it means England are the world champions.
It coincided with the appearance of an article in Time magazine nominating London as the swinging city, with a brief selection of fashion notes and the main cultural movements of recent years. It included helpful maps and, for serious clubbers, where the principal action might be found.
To me, I'm not a Puritan by any means, or a moralist, but to me, the idea, for instance, of short skirts and things like that, this seems to be, we seem to be selling our morals in return for a mess of cultural politics in a way. Short skirts, for instance, are a sexual thing in order to show as much of a girl's legs as possible. To me, we seem to have lost a certain amount of moral fibre, I suppose you call it.
The film industry's response to the new mood of abandonment, released in that same summer of 1966, was to be one of the biggest commercial successes of the decade.
Hello? They never make these cars big enough, do they? Well, you all settled in? Right, we can begin. My name is...
Alfie?
Alfie.
He epitomized the attitude of a lot of men in the 60s, which there had always been tremendous immorality, you know. I mean, to put it quite frankly, you could never get laid. I mean, I came from South London, which was like living in Sicily without the sunshine or the pasta. I mean, you only had to look at a girl twice and the brothers came round and kicked the daylights out of you, you know? You had to get married. I mean, it was real shotgun wedding time. And then suddenly the 60s came, you know, and the girls all burned their bras. After everybody spent 10 years trying to figure out how to do the clips. And we went, wow. And so Alfie was there, you know. And Alfie was archetypal of that. And his attitude was rather the same as the sort of start of the women's liberation movement, where they said, we're going to go out, for instance, and have sex. We don't care about romance anymore. We would just go out and have sex with who we want to do it, and we don't care. Well, that's how the men were, except they did it first.
this you're up with this woman from a foot comfort service? I was
Alfie had in fact been written much earlier by the northern playwright Bill Norton. His extraordinarily sharp observation was actually of a Cockney Lothario of the 1950s.
She's got a little ginger moustache. But I find I'm quite willing to overlook the odd blemish in a woman, provided she's got something else to make up for it. Do you folks at home know where you're going?
I haven't got any.
Ah, there must be somebody.
I want to make a new start in London.
I played Annie, who was a girl from up north who had hitched rides to London and then got picked up by Alfie. And because she was so keen to be domesticated and look after him and really put him first and herself second, she kind of did herself out of being his girlfriend, because she became less and less glamorous the more she was worrying about his steak and kidney puddings and scrubbing the floor, whatever it was.
But for me, Alfie was a wonderful character to play. Wonderful. Especially talking to the screen, to the camera, directly into the lens. I like that.
It's pretty fair on the other and all. It's a bit on the shy side, but I find it makes quite a change these days. Oi, turn it down a bit, Annie.
It was interesting to have a hero who one at the same time disapproved of strongly, but you couldn't help being charmed by him. So, you know, nothing's black and white. That's what's good about that film.
She don't keep asking you, do you love her, like these young birds do. She don't never mention love. She knows what she wants and she's going to get it, if there's any going.
Well, it was typical of the 60s, is you could say anything. And I mean, he talked about his girlfriend's period being late, which had never been discussed on the screen very much, you know, when she was pregnant, especially in a comedy.
Is today the 22nd?
Yeah, I think so.
Shouldn't our little friend have arrived on the 19th?
Oh, don't worry, he'll turn up. He always has done.
Here, come and have a look at this a minute.
Did any of your friends live this kind of life?
Have you caught the scene?
All of them. They all lived this kind of life. But they didn't go out with older women, they went out with younger ones. There was none of that toy boy game then. Nobody fancied older women then.
I noticed it, I noticed it with English girls, of course, because they took off their corsets and they started wearing miniskirts. That immediately made them beautiful. But guys understood it as well. Guys were kind of growing their hair and using their sister's shampoo and stuff. So you were suddenly seeing iron fighters working on scaffolds, you know, who were looking like Botticelli figures, you know. Like, you go to a restaurant, not because the food was good, because it was a great movie. That meant it was filled with these beautiful people that were like seeing themselves as beautiful.
Terence Stamp, one of the beautiful people of 60s London, cropped up in helmets and plumes in Yanni, Schlesinger and Raphael's follow-up to Darling, far from the madding crowd. The fact that this fashionable team could contemplate a trip to Hardy country is testimony to the feeling of the American backers that anything British was bound to be of interest. Madding Crowd was full of craft and skillful filmmaking, but it failed to win an audience, most damagingly in America. Perhaps Swinging London just didn't translate to Wessex.
Ah, Miss Everdeen, little did I think it was you. The Queen of the Coal Market herself I was speaking to the other night. I'm sorry if I offended you, but it does seem a bit hard.
What seems hard?
That ill luck should follow a man for honestly telling a woman she's beautiful.
It's not your honesty I take exception to. It's your impudence.
Miss Everdeen, you do forgive me, don't you?
I do not.
How can you blame me for your looks? A woman like you does more damage than she can conceivably imagine.
Please go away. I'd rather you didn't talk to me again.
I felt like I was the center of the universe then, you know, when that film was being made. We were in the public eye, you know. And we were in that song, of course, that the Kinks, Waterloo Sunset, you know. Terry and Julie cross over the bridge or something. That was supposed to be us, you know.
Terry and Julie cross over the river, people are sort of having a good time,
I don't know whether when I say a majority, I don't know, because one only knows a certain group of people, and maybe it's a minority. But it seems to me that a good time is much easier had by all now than ever before.
I don't remember the 60s being a great time of pleasure. I think there was a lot of energy about it, and I think there was an optimism. If there was a lot of pleasure going on, it was in the next street. I didn't see it. But there was a lot of, I think well, our generation was younger anyway, clearly, and we did feel that there was the possibility of change. So I think what we did was, you know, in a small way, was a reflection of that optimism and that feeling that things could change.
Ken Loach came from another tradition of 60s filmmaking, television. He'd started with Z-Cars and the Wednesday plays, and was famous for semi-improvised dialogue as seen in Up the Junction and Kathy Come Home, showing the other side of the coin of 60s hedonism. Offered his first feature film, he brought the TV actress Carol White with him. But his producer, Joseph Yanni, decided that he could also do with an established film star.
The thing I remember about this movie was it was again produced by Joe Yanni, but and on Madding, with the money I'd earned from Far From the Madding Crowd, I'd bought myself a Rolls Royce. And Joe Yanni begged me not to come to work in it because he said, Ken Loach is a communist. He won't like it.
I guess I felt a wee bit out of my depths, really, about all that. I mean, Terence Stamp did his, you know, he was a nice fellow and he did his best like everyone else. I mean, his background was right. I didn't feel he jarred in the film, in what he did at all. But of course, he was known beyond the film, so people saw not only him, but his previous work.
A bird in there with him, of about 24, settler, and a little fella with him, too. There's 3 in there. We're going to go in 4-handed.
Well, the way we work anyway, it's always worked with us. The driver takes the car, he's responsible for the car angle. Yeah. That's fair enough, really.
You've got to have a ringer, there's no fancying about it.
I don't mind, I mean, you know, you've got one before.
They used real people. You know, they had kind of real kind of gangsters, you know, mixed in with us kind of thing. And the locations were actually locations where these characters would have lived, you know, the block of flats, not unlike these. I mean, these are in much better shape, but the place where we shot were kind of trust buildings at the Elephant and Castle. And they were actually like vacant prior to knocking them down.
That's the time I love the best.
As I recall, you know, the crew, like Ken Loach was interesting, he hand-picked his crew, so he was not only picking people who were sort of politically sympathetic, but was picking the real working-class crew, you know. So the whole thing had a kind of a realism about it that I hadn't really encountered before.
Be not too hard when he is sold and bought, for he...
Poor Cow was written by Nell Dunn from her observations of working-class life.
In a way, one of the things about Poor Cow is that she was a working-class young woman, Joy, and she did cut loose from the ordinary progression of life in that she married someone who then went to prison.
Be not too hard.
And in a way, the genesis of Poor Cow, again, was to try and see what happened to somebody who just went off on a, you know, who headed for the open sea, emotionally. And what happened?
Blimey, you don't have a chunky marmalade, sir?
What?
Oh, I can't stand that jelly marmalade.
Little Johnny likes it.
Nell would sort of say the same, but Cal would respond to the situation very much in the same way. And my guess is we would have rehearsed this very little, just basically what was going to happen. So that again, you know, you'd try to get an open-ended quality about it.
Oh, there you go.
True.
But I mean, I guess it was meant to be saucy rather than a heavy breathing scene.
Go.
No, this time, save the road is much slower, and you can linger on the kiss. And then you move across.
Moving a bit more.
Oh, yes. He brought along his production team and a large number of people who were used to working in a much more kind of heavily laden manner.
15683.
In the traditional feature film way. It really stamped on and swamped whatever it was the off-the-cuff way that we tried to work. And the two things were absolutely opposed. So we were carrying around a kind of huge crew for something that really we could have done much better with a small camera just walking along the street.
They weren't structured like a normal film. You know, you do a master, you do a medium, you do a close-up, you do a reverse close-up. His was just sort of like big master shots, and you just played till the film ran out a lot of the time. Like today. Like right now.
I suppose my life's over. Well, you only get one chance. I got a great pain in me yesterday.
We don't know what's going to happen to Joy at the end of the story, but all in all, it seemed to me she had a lot of excitement, a lot of adventure, a lot of things happening, a lot of difficulties. And she tackled them, she struggled.
Towards the end of the 60s, I mean, I was still, I think, still just trying to have a good time. And I lived in a flat, I remember, with, well, several men and several women. And this just shows how strange that was at the time. Now everybody does that. It's not a strange thing at all. But the papers got hold of it, the tabloids got hold of it, and they just went to town as if I was, I don't know, as if that meant that we were permanently screwing from morning till night, every one, sort of ourselves, the cat, the dog, everything else. And they couldn't, I mean, it was obviously shocking.
There's also a downside. In fact, the ending of Poor Cow I like when she says, to think when I was a kid I planned to conquer the world. And if anyone saw me now, they'd say, she's had a rough night, poor cow. And in a way, to a certain extent, that does sum up the 60s sort of sexual revolution for me. That, you know, we did plan to conquer the world and have a terrific time and have as many love affairs as we wanted. And there was also a kind of crash. You know, things went quite badly wrong. People got in a muddle.
The honeymoon years in which pleasure and personal fulfillment could be pursued as ends in themselves were bound to lead to some kind of burnout. Filmmakers like Ken Loach already had sensed that it was time for a rediscovery of the real minutiae of people's lives.
And there's more next Thursday at 9:40. Tonight, a caustic look at a week of telly with Guardian critic Charlie Brooker next.